So let's go ahead and create our WebSocket directory. Go down to server. I'll create it here. Say WS server, WS server TS. And for this guy, we're actually going to get most of the code from the tRPC example. Let me make this full screen. Let's go to tRPC, subscriptions. Go to the next Prisma starter and go to server. All right, so we're going to go ahead and copy all of this. This is in the WSS dev server. I'm going to paste that here. And then we're just going to make a couple changes. So we want our context from tRPC context, tRPC routers, let's go over here, router. Okay, we don't have node fetch or WS, so what we can do for that is add it with PMPM. So let's say PMPM add WS node fetch at types WS and then at types node fetch. And we also actually want to get version 2. And that's because if we try to do version 3, then we're going to get ESM errors. So let's run that. Okay, let's restart our TypeScript server. All right, and so here we're assigning fetch to our global fetch, and that's because Node.js doesn't have fetch, and we need that. Then we're creating our WebSocket server on port 3001. Then we're creating a handler using the apply WS handler, which is an adapter from tRPC up here. And so we're passing that the WebSocket server, our app router, and then create context, which has an error. We'll get to that. Then we have WebSocket server on connection. We're console log that we just added a connection. When a connection closes, we're console logging that we removed the connection. Then we have this console log saying that we're listening on port 3001. And then when we get sigterm, which is killing the process, we console log that we got sigterm. We're broadcasting a reconnect notification to our clients, and then we're closing this WebSocket server. All right. And so now with this guy, it's not liking what we're passing to our create next context options. And so we can actually steal that from here. Go to context. So we should be adding this as well. All right, let's close this. All right, so here, should have or that. And unfortunately, we can't use the unstable getSession here with our WebSocket, so we're going to have to use session or getSession from NextAuth. And so if we go over to NextAuth, we can see that you really want to use unstable getSession because When you don't, then you're making an extra API call. So here we can see this method can drastically reduce response time when used over getSession server side due to avoiding an extra fetch to an API route. So, of course, we'd rather use unstable, but with the WebSocket server, we can't, which is unfortunate. And so we have that. We also need to create a different TypeScript config. And so what we can do is copy that from here. So we have tsconfig server JSON. Okay, so we can create that down here. tsconfig server JSON. Okay. And so now we actually can create an endpoint for our subscription. So let's go back to our server. Go to routers, host. And so here we can see they create an event emitter with the types. So we can copy that. Let's create a file real quick. That way we can pass it to our context. So we're going to say event emitter ts. Paste it here. And for our events, we want a sendMessage event. And that's going to take a conversation ID, which is a string, and then a user ID, which is also a string. And so that way, when we send a message, we know which user should get the notification, and then we know what conversation ID that message belongs to. And then here we can get this from events. All right, and then so in our context, actually, let's export this. Oops. In our context, we can now import EE, and we want to bring that in from our web server event emitter. Okay, so now over in our chats, we can add that. So we can say onSendMessage equals a protected procedure. Let's close this, move this to the middle. And that is a subscription, which will take a function. And then here we're going to say return observable. This comes from tRPC. And this guy is going to return a conversation ID string. And then we're going to pass a function here that takes Emit. Okay. And so in here, we want to say event emitter, which we need a context for. So let's pass a context. So context event emitter on sendMessage. Then we need a callback because we need to tell it what we want to do when we get a sendMessage event. So we're going to say const on sendMessage. And this guy has a data that takes conversation ID, which is a string, and user ID, which is a string. Okay. And then so in here, we're going to say if data.userid equals context session user ID. Then we actually want to emit next our conversation ID, which is the data conversation ID. Right, so when we subscribe and we get a sendMessage event, we actually want to run this. And then when we unsubscribe, we want to tell our event emitter that this is the event and the callback that we want to unsubscribe from. Okay. And so let's walk through this real quick. When we subscribe, we're returning an observable that will return a conversation ID that's of type string. We're saying our event emitter on this event, which is sendMessage, we want to run this callback on sendMessage. That callback will take a conversation ID or a user ID. A conversation ID and a user ID. And then we check, is this the same user ID of the person who wanted to subscribe to this event? If it is, then we actually will pass them that conversation ID of the event. And now we know this is what our callback needs, because in here, in our event emitter, in our my events, we say sendMessage is a function that takes conversation ID and user ID. Okay. And so now all we need to do is actually emit this event when we send a message. So let's go up to our sendMessage. So here we can say context EE dot emit. And we can say sendMessage. And then what we want to do, we want to pass the conversation ID, which is conversation.id, or conversation.id, and then user ID, which is a user ID that we pass. So this is when we actually create a conversation, right? But then when we already have a conversation ID, we want to emit an event here as well. But here we actually need to know which user we're emitting that to. So we actually need a query for that. So let's say, and let's bring this out of the transaction, because it's fine if we don't notify the user that we messaged them, but we don't want that. If that fails, we actually don't send the message. I think they can always just not get the notification, but eventually see that they got a message. So we can paste that here. But then we actually want to find the user that we need to send this event to. So we're going to say await or const user equals await Prisma conversation user find. Let me say find first. Let's say where conversation ID is the conversation ID that we passed. And then we can say not user ID is the session user. So that's the person who sent the message. Obviously, we don't want to send an event to them. And now that we have that user, we can say sendMessage, pass the conversation ID, and we can pass the user ID, which is coming from user ID. And we can just say that they're there because you have to have a recipient per conversation. And then we can say in here, select user ID true. Okay, so let's step back for a second. So what are we doing? When we create a conversation, we know the user ID and we also know the conversation ID. So here we're emitting the events that we've sent a message, and we're passing that conversation ID and that user ID. But when we already have a conversation created, we only send that conversation ID. So that means we then have to query for the recipient and get their user ID. And so once we get that, then we can emit that we've sent a message. and then pass that conversation ID and that user ID. And then that we'll call the function down here, this onSendMessage. Make sure that the person who subscribed, that's their user ID, and then it'll pass them the conversation ID. Now, we could also pass the user ID when we're sending a message, but again, because that's coming from the client, anyone could just pass another person's user ID, and then now they'll get these events that someone sent them a message. I don't know why they want to do that, but we're just mitigating that risk here. So now we just need a way to actually start up our server. So let's go ahead and head to package.json and add dev ws equals tsx watch source ws server tx, and then we have a ts config, which is ts config server JSON. Oops. And now we need to install tsx, but we also can install npm run all. That way you can run them in parallel. So let's say npm run all tsx. All right. Okay, and so now we can change this to dev next, and then we can say dev run p, which means run in parallel, dev star. Okay. So now let's see. We say pm dev. Okay, did I not save that? Okay, let's see now. Oh, it needs to be server, ws server. So let's say server, ws server. Okay, node env is required. So let's say node env equals development. Let's try to run that again. Okay, cool. So it's listening on port 3001. Now we just need to hook up our front end to it. So let's go to try to look for utils. That was tRPC. There we go. And so here, instead of a HTTP batch link, we can add the WebSocket link. So let's go here. And I believe it's source utils tRPC. Okay, get ending link. So let's copy this. Paste it here. Let's make some changes. Change this to get base URL. Get base URL. Okay, we need you. And then our URL is ws:// localhost 3001. Got the WS link. Okay. And now here, instead of this, we want to call get ending link. Pass it our context. and then get our context from here. All right. And so now, let me save this. And what's going on over here? Did I not save this? So now, go to our chat. Oops. And we can say const, actually no, tRPC, chat, onSendMessage, use subscription. We're not passing any variables. And we can say on data. And we want to get the conversation ID out of there. And then with this guy, we actually want utils. So we're going to say utils equals tRPC use context. And so that way we can say utils chat conversations and validate. And then utils chat messages and validate where the conversation ID is that past conversation ID. Okay. So that should be it. Let's go ahead and check it. All right, we're here. Move this over. Okay, we're getting loading. See what we got. Okay, unauthorized. Bet you it has to do with our context. It looks like we're not getting this session. Yeah, we need to pass the request here. Let's try that. Try restarting this. Okay. Let's see what we got. Okay, if I say hello, all right. If I say hi, okay. Looks like we're good. But this button's not good though. So let's see what's going on here. Okay, let's go to text area. Check out that button. Yeah. We're not calling sendMessage. Let's try that again. All right. Cool. Okay. Now we just need to add our change theme logic. And I think we're good.